Good morning and welcome to the 19th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have received apologies from Craig Hoy and Ross Greer. The first item on our public agenda today is to take evidence on the cost effectiveness of Scottish public inquiries. I therefore welcome to the meeting Rebecca McKee, Senior Researcher from the Institute for Government, and Mary Morgan, Chief Executive at NHS National Services Scotland. So Mary, we've received your submission. We haven't got a submission from you, Rebecca, so I'm just wondering if you can take a couple of minutes to talk through what the Institute of Government does in relation to public inquiries.
Writing me up. As a bit of background, in 2017, the Institute for Government published a report on public inquiries. Since then, our thinking has moved on a little bit. So I've been doing some research since January with Emma Norris, who's our Deputy Director, trying to kind of look at. It feels like the political context has shifted. We now across the UK have 20 current ongoing public inquiries, and they're costing more. And I feel like the more attention is rightly being focused on that. So we've been primarily looking at the UK government, but obviously the lessons draw across in the way that the Act is applied and used for public inquiries in Scotland. So I will try and speak to that as much as possible. We've conducted numerous interviews, we've held roundtables, one of which was jointly held with Inquest and Dr. Emma Ireton, who you heard from last week. And the things that we've also been looking at other jurisdictions. So we've been looking at case studies. So, for example, we published one on New Zealand, so looking at their public inquiry reform in 2013. And again, looking at where you can draw lessons and kind of where you can't. We've also looked at the Dutch model. So the Dutch Safety Board, who ran the Dutch COVID inquiry, but also do lots of other types of inquiries and reviews. And our research has looked into the framework of inquiry. So we've been thinking about how you get past the distraction almost of statutory versus non-statutory and trying to think about how you can reimagine that framework and actually get at more quickly the challenges that really lie underneath. We've been looking at the decision-making process primarily in the UK government, which is around how ministers are supported to make decisions when they begin a public inquiry, how chairs and teams are supported to set up an inquiry, and kind of how important that process is at the beginning. And then the third thing we've been looking at is around monitoring and implementation, which speaks to this effectiveness of the kind of cost effectiveness part of what I think you're looking at. So without any kind of formal mechanisms for monitoring and implementation, we've been looking at some of the options that are available and the feasibility of some of those options as well. And I think the way that we're currently looking at it, we're hoping to publish a public report in the coming months, is that we feel like there's kind of like a package of reforms to get at this kind of cost, time, effectiveness question. So we're currently thinking through how all of those kind of reforms might work together.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I mean, the first thing you touched on was the fact that there are now 20 public inquiries. In 1997, there was never more than 5. We've got 2 new ones this year. Do you think the government jumps too quickly to a public inquiry in order to assuage some public concerns, as a way perhaps of almost kicking it into touch, perhaps?
I mean, I think there's multiple reasons why there's a lot of public and political pressure to hold a public inquiry, and particularly to hold kind of a full judge-led statutory inquiry, and that kind of language is very pervasive, I think, in the UK context. I think one of the problems is that there isn't really this setup of like guidance and instruction to kind of support ministers to choose the right option. So you have an issue of public concern, you know that you want to look at it, and it's often quite not easy, but it feels like the kind of route where you're going to it feels like the kind of easy option to go for a public inquiry. And actually, I think we need to have is a much better guidance around the suite of options that are available. And again, that's something that sometimes in other countries they're often better at. And it's one of the things when we looked at New Zealand that their guidance is really around like taking the topic and looking at what is the most appropriate option for inquiry or for review. Whereas, yes, I feel like the kind of jump to public inquiry happens a lot more quickly.
I mean, another thing you touched on was statutory, non-statutory and judge-led. I mean, I looked at the kind of figures over the last 30 years UK wide, and in the last decade, 23 out of 24 public inquiries have been judge-led. The decade before that, it was 18 out of 23. And then the decade before that, it was 20 out of 33. Do you think now there's almost like, you know, unless a public inquiry is judge-led, it's not considered to be the gold standard that those who clamour for such inquiries demand?
Yeah, there's definitely a perception issue. So our research hasn't looked at, for example, the effectiveness of different types of chairs. That's something that we might go into in the future. But I think you can definitely say there's a perception issue, and that seems like the gold standard, the most forensic way of kind of getting at what you might think you want to get at. And I think the other issue is that there isn't this kind of guidance and support at the beginning that allows ministers, officials to kind of just take a beat and think through who is the right person for this role. Is it someone like a policy specialist? Is it a panel of multidisciplinary experts? Is it a judge? In which case it may well be. I think the other thing, and an area that I think is quite interesting to look at, is not just who chairs it, but also when you're writing up the recommendations, who's involved in that process as well. So it might be that a judge, for example, is the right person to have as the chair, but then it's like, who do you involve in testing recommendations and writing recommendations? And I think that's all kind of part of it when you look at the kind of jump to potentially a judge-led inquiry.
Now, Mary, you've said that increased consistency in how inquiries are conducted will lead to better cost effectiveness. But if they're going to be judge-led, you know, they might be consistent, but it's not going to have a positive impact in terms of the costs, because one of the issues that is of concern with regard to judge-led inquiries is that they do seem to be much longer in terms of the time they actually take to undertake the evidential aspect of the inquiry and indeed publish the report. Is that a concern that you have, given the implications for the health service?
I think it's interesting to hear Rebecca speak, because many of the things that she's spoken about are things that we experience, and you'll see from our submission we touch on many of those subject matters that are researched. So it's really good to hear that these are being looked at from that perspective. We speak from the position of experience, and I would suggest that we only have experience of judge-led inquiries, but they do seem to be very different in terms of approach, and I think we've highlighted some of that. So, for example, we find that terms of reference are very, very clear, but there isn't anything around a timeline of expectations set out from the outset. It doesn't seem that there is clarity around budget setting around from the outset, and also very much up to the individual judges who and how core participants are led into those inquiries. So, for example, in the currently ongoing UK COVID inquiry, initially NSS and Public Health Scotland, separate core participants, had separate legal teams with separate costs associated with that. And in more recent modules, we asked the inquiry judge if we could share our legal team and legal counsel, even though we remain separate core participants. And that seemed to be something that makes that a bit more cost effective. But it's up to individual inquiries and inquiry teams how those pieces are taken forward. And I think the other thing that we spoke about is inquiries are long.
That's what I'm about to go on to next.
My experience of inquiries are very long. The COVID inquiry we're talking about, the UK COVID inquiry, Scottish COVID inquiry, we'll be talking about things that happened 5 years ago. I was a witness in the UK COVID inquiry just on Thursday last week, and I was speaking about things that happened 5 years ago. There are still a number of modules to be undertaken in that inquiry. Likewise, for the Scottish Hospitals inquiry, we're speaking about things that have gone on for a long period of time. The infected blood inquiry and the Penrose inquiry both looked at things that had happened many, many, many years ago, when contributors may be very elderly or indeed deceased. So they do go on for a very long, long period of time, but it's not us that's driving that. It's the members of the public, it's the people who are affected by those subject matters that are being responded to in terms of those queries, I believe. But so they do take a very long time. Having the interim findings, interim reports are helpful, because at least that means that some of the recommendations can start to be dealt with earlier than waiting for the end of the inquiry. but they're not all consistent in that approach either.
That's great. You've more or less answered the next two questions I was going to ask you, but I will go back to timetables, because one of the things your timescale, one of the things you've talked about is, work being undertaken in modules. So basically, I take it your view then is that if different aspects of inquiry can be looked at in parallel, as opposed to kind of two-dimensionally, whereby it just, it's one after the other, that can reduce the time frame for the inquiry.
Well, I'm not sure about reducing a time frame. Maybe it's a little bit about cutting up chunks of evidence.
But will doing that not reduce the time frame by itself? If you're doing that, will that not be helpful?
I think it's helpful in order for us to be able to focus our resources on a particular subject matter area. So, for example, a previous module in the UK COVID inquiry looked solely at procurement, and that meant that we could define the resources, the specific resources that we required to input into answering the questions of that part of the module. And equally, the most recent one I gave evidence in was around test and protect. So it meant that we had some boundaries around that, which released other people to carry on doing the work. If you have a very broad area, not well defined about in kind of modules or areas, topics that are going to be looked at in what particular order, it becomes a much broader way of having to respond to the inquiry, and it means actually that we are less able to be helpful to the inquiry as witnesses, because that's what we're there to do, is to help inquiries to find the answers to the questions.
No, that's helpful. I'm just exploring different ways of actually carrying things out, timelessly and less expensively, frankly. I mean, one of the things that you've also said is that NSS suggests that current process for monitoring public inquiry costs are inadequate and costs are not reimbursed or reported consistently, and there's no oversight of costs incurred.
Yeah, so we will frequently receive FOIs to ask how much we are spending on inquiries, and I think the costs that are included within the documentation for this inquiry relate to the costs that are incurred by inquiries. So their structures, rather than the costs that are incurred by individual public bodies, because that can be difficult to ascertain. So very frequently we're asked in FOIs for that. The inquiries and the judges, the inquiry teams, do have the opportunity to reimburse individual core participants or participants for their costs associated with that public inquiry. But as a public body, we are expected to consume the costs of participating in an inquiry, so do not get those reimbursed to us. That comes out of our baseline functions. So where we've outlined costs in this area that NSS has incurred, we've set up a team to help us respond to inquiries. The costs that are there of the direct team and our direct legal costs associated with two inquiries that are laid out in that space. But that doesn't include the cost that would be incurred by myself, for example, in preparing the witness statement or giving evidence or travelling to London to do so. And that can be quite considerable for a range of staff, nor does it include the opportunity cost of prioritising inquiry work over and above the day-to-day activities.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next, the opportunity cost. What has been the opportunity cost in terms of the NSS over the last decade or so in terms of participating and being involved in public inquiries?
Yeah, so it's measured in the impact on service delivery.
Indeed.
So I mean that's really where it is, and our antimicrobial resistance healthcare associated infection team are involved in providing witness work to Scottish Hospitals Inquiry, UK COVID Inquiry, Scottish COVID Inquiry, and there's another one that they're involved with as well. And I wrote to all of the inquiry judges in that regard to say, could they please be cognizant of the timescales of the questions they were asking, the witness requirements they were asking, because this same team has got to deliver service at the same time.
So is there any measurement, sorry, of what the impact of that has been in terms of patients? Because you've got the inquiry almost as a bubble and all resources funnel towards that inquiry, but you've got the rest of the work that you have to do as an organisation, and that's clearly impacted upon that. So if we're looking at a balance between, you know, the needs of an inquiry and the needs of the service, where are we in that?
So in part, staff have worked, setting up the team, the dedicated team, our inquiries team was really helpful because they've organised, we learned that from Penrose Inquiry and in part UK infected blood inquiry. We set that up really to maintain strong administration, to keep us right in terms of the requests for statements that were coming through, and to take away some of that work from those frontline workers. Many of the staff who are required to give witness statements or indeed to attend as witnesses at inquiries are senior staff, and they've worked their weekends and their evenings to maintain their service and to do that. So there isn't actually any formal measurement that we've undertaken around impact, other than supporting people as best as possible, employing additional staff where we can, and finding other ways to make sure that both the requirements of inquiries, legal requirements of inquiries, and indeed service has continued. But that can also be at personal cost to the individuals who are doing that.
Thank you. I mean, Rebecca, has Institute for Government looked at the impact on services when an inquiry comes in and soaks up a huge amount of money from a specific area, whether it's policing, whether it's NHS or whatever, and the impact that has on service delivery? Is that something that you've
No, it's not something that we've looked at yet, but I think listening to what you've been saying, I think that's a really interesting kind of part of the puzzle. We've primarily been focused on the actual inquiries themselves and kind of the body of the inquiries and then relationship with government.
Yeah, because it's not done, you know, without impact on these other areas. I mean, and that's a kind of issue, because if it's an NHS-based inquiry, the NHS is more or less expected to fund it from resources that would otherwise go into, you know, doctors, nurses, medicines and patients.
Yeah, I think that speaks to one of the other kind of thematic issues, which is that because public inquiries are ad hoc organisations, that some organisations like yourselves will have developed good methods of engaging with inquiries, but for each new inquiry, that's a new relationship. So although you can have like your structures internally, trying to develop that with each new inquiry, and that I think comes down to some of the issues that we have been looking at, which is around how you can do that kind of lesson learning, knowledge sharing, training even kind of at the start of an inquiry to say, if you are going to be engaging with this public body or that public body, they have this team already, or this is what we've learnt previously.
I mean, there's always going to be an impact on services, giving them time, etc., etc. But in terms of resources, is there an argument for a separate fund for public inquiries, so that when a public inquiry is announced by the government, they could dip into a specific fund to try and, you know, mitigate some of the impacts on the NHS or the justice or whoever?
That's not something we've looked at yet, but I think there are issues. Yeah, there's definitely questions around the funding of inquiries and the funding of participants. I think what's interesting, and we haven't looked at that, so I don't have an answer, but if I think about what they did in New Zealand, they actually pulled back on some of the funding and made it much harder, so that you have to request more funding for like core participant legal teams and things like that in order to drive down costs. And I guess there's a question there of what is the right answer for this context, but it's not something we've looked at.
Now, one of the things, actually, you know, that Mary's said in her submission is that clarity in the scope of inquiry, terms of reference and timelines in the outset is a key to cost effectiveness. Would you agree with any assessment on that?
Yeah, it's that kind of, there's several stages, but I think that setting up phase, when there's a lot of public, a lot of political pressure to kind of get going on an issue as quickly as possible, is where they're kind of, from the people that we've been talking to in the roundtables and interviews, etc., in our research, there isn't that time being taken to kind of think through what is the purpose of what we're trying to achieve, what is the correct model, and then if you pick the model of public inquiry, what is the exact scope? Like, that's can be a very politically difficult decision to make, But it has to be made then, because if not, then the inquiry is kind of is being left to kind of muddle through on its own.
Are there any inquiries that you can think of where the terms of reference have been kind of spot on and helped delivery of a kind of tight inquiry? Or in contrast, are there anywhere you feel that the terms of reference have been so woolly that it's led to a kind of unsatisfactory kind of, almost developing, going on all sorts of running off in different directions and stuff like that, rather than focusing on what the core purpose of the inquiry was perhaps meant to be?
Yeah, I can't think off the top of my head exactly two perfect examples from that. But on the whole, when we held our roundtable, it was felt that most of the recent inquiries, the terms of reference hadn't been desirable or as effective as they could be. And sometimes that is because they are developed quite quickly, sometimes even before a lot of the inquiry team are on board, and that kind of consultation process about what actually is achievable, what is desirable, kind of that conversation isn't being had early on. I can't off the top of my head think of specific examples, but I can find some.
I don't know if you've got any specific examples at all, Mary, of anything like that, but I'm just wondering, do you feel that in terms of reference that Mary have set, they should stick with those terms of reference for an inquiry, or because understand that on occasion the terms of reference can actually change during an inquiry and it can be widened or deepened?
Yeah, I can't think off the top of my head where I've experienced something that has been widened or deepened.
There's certainly been calls for that, I should say.
Yeah, that it's important. I mean, the question here is, why is a public inquiry in every form held? And I didn't realise until I was asked to come here today that there were actually different forms of or different opportunities for public inquiries, panel approaches and these things that Rebecca has spoken about. I just thought a public inquiry was a judge-led statutory public inquiry, and that's what we needed to do. But they're there to represent or to deliver answers, yes, for ministers, but predominantly for those members of the public who have been affected, and to learn lessons to go forward. And I guess, like any investigation, even an organisational investigation, if things are found or discovered or more answers need to be explored, then I guess there's an agreement between ministers and the judge to change terms of reference in that way if they feel that something is going to be left unanswered. I don't believe that we have spent particular attention to that, other than the Central Legal Office, which is part of our organisation, will have looked at that at the time if there was any changes that happened. I think there was one, maybe the Penrose inquiry possibly, when there was a change of judge. The terms of reference were slightly changed at that point. So I think those provide the opportunity for a new judge coming along to say, actually, at this particular time, is this going to be a possible thing? I think there was a particular issue around timeline around that, because it originally had been expected to report within a timeline, and that was changed with a new judge coming along, I understand. But really, those things are not whilst they're of concern for us in terms of the evidence we might need to offer or to lead, it's not within our remit really to influence at that level.
Yeah. I mean, on the surface, public inquiries are pretty straightforward, what happened, why did it happen, who's to blame, and how do we stop it happening again? And yet, look where we are. Now, Mary, in your submission, you talked about Section 28 of the Fatal Accidents and Sudden Death, etc. Scotland Act 2016, which introduced the requirement that those to whom FAI recommendations are directed must provide a response to an FAI's determination within 8 weeks, which sets out what changes have been made or are proposed, or the reasons why no actions have been taken. And you're suggesting a similar requirement could be introduced in law requiring participants in public inquiries to report to Parliament with a written response to the inquiry's reports. And you said this is a positive step which occurred in the UK infected blood inquiry. So I just wonder if you can talk us through this a wee bit, your thinking behind this.
So it's in the Infected Blood Inquiry that there was a recommendation that, well, there was a list of recommendations, but there was also a recommendation, a requirement for a response to be given to the judge in that space to say what had been done. So recommendations obviously are made to government, so it's government who provides the response for what has actually been done. It closes the loop. It's as simple as that. One's given a list of recommendations. How do you know that those recommendations have been taken forward unless that loop is closed to say this is how it's being dealt with? Some recommendations will take a long time and a lot of resources to implement. Some recommendations may already have been implemented in the course of the inquiry, because one can't wait 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 8 years to make changes to how we operate. So some may well already have been made by way of changes. And I think that's what's really helpful in having interim reports coming forward. There have been an interim report from the Scottish Hospitals Inquiry, and UK Inquiry placed a report after Module 1 in terms of pandemic preparedness. So that means that although the inquiries are ongoing, mechanisms to effect change and to meet those recommendations can be underway. So it's an important piece of closing a loop. That's simple.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, inquiries have ranged from inquiry recommendations have ranged from 1 to 290. And between 1990 and 2024, 54 inquiries made 3,175 recommendations. Now, Mary's made quite an interesting point, about interim recommendations. I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that are. And just to add that the Thirlwall inquiry investigating the circumstances surrounding the actions of former nurse Lucy Letby conducted a review of past inquiry recommendations on healthcare issues and found that many had not been acted on. So recommendations are made, government accepts them, and then nothing seems to happen.
Yeah, I think so. There's 2 points there. One of which is, and again, speaking to this cost effectiveness of the effectiveness of inquiries, is that we have examples of where we potentially wouldn't have had repeated tragedies or disasters if recommendations had been taken up. The Thirlwall inquiry is one of those as well, but also the Bristol Royal Infirmary inquiry in 2001. It's likely that if the recommendations had been taken on, then the Mid-Staffs Hospitals inquiry might have been avoided, for example. So there's a few different examples of that. So that is one thing where we can maybe get onto that, talking about the kind of implementation side of things. There's also around the number of recommendations, interim reports. I think interim reports have been very, very helpful where they've been used, and it speaks again to this, the flexibility of our inquiry system actually being really important. And I think any reforms need to essentially support the flexibility, allow chairs to know their subject area, and then say an interim report here is actually very helpful because we want to make some early recommendations. I want the inquiry to still be open while people are working on those recommendations, so I can call them back in, for example, to ask them how that's progressing, rather than reporting at the end, closing an inquiry, and then not having anything in place to monitor the implementation.
I mean, Professor Cameron, who gave evidence to the committee 2 weeks ago, talked about the Jersey child abuse inquiry, and he said that they went back 2 years later after the inquiry concluded to see what recommendations had or had not been implemented. But he says, in his experience, that's the only kind of time that's really happened. I'm just wondering if both, this will be my last question, you'll be pleased to know before I'm up to colleagues around the table, is I wonder if our witnesses feel that that's something that should be de rigueur, basically, in terms of public inquiries.
You want to go? Well, we've said that we think that would be appropriate, and I've said already that closing the loop is really important. I think the interesting thing, one of the things that you said that inquiries are there for, is to find out who's to blame. And I'm not that I think is an aside. They don't set out with finding out blame. They find out about the learns.
But that's what
so
people
on.
who call for the inquiries often are seeking.
Absolutely. But inquiries don't have that power to. They can criticise and so on and so forth. They may be looking for that, but inquiries are, as I understand it, are not there necessarily.
I was just trying to put it
blame.
in blunt language, because that's really often what folk are like. If something's happened and I want to know who did it and why they did it, and make sure it's not going to happen again.
Yeah. And the findings very often in a public inquiry, the outcomes of those that are multifactorial. It's not sort of one individual, one organisation, one thing. There are lots of things that could have been done better, or could be done better, right through inquiry findings. So I think it is really important. I think it's really important actually when an inquiry is set up, that it's set up with the end in mind. And I don't mean to preempt inquiries' findings at all. I don't mean that. But I do mean that the provision should be made on the basis of understanding that the inquiry is going to come out with recommendations, and those recommendations may well need resourced, with people, with money, with funding, with technology, whatever that might be. I think the other thing that we need to bear in mind is that the world will change in the time period of that inquiry. So while they're looking back at something that happened 5 years ago, 6 years ago, so on, the world has moved on. And my experience would be that there is not always a look at what is contemporaneous in the world just now. So if one's looking at, I don't know, COVID inquiry testing, for example, we're asked the question about the length of time it takes to introduce testing platforms in 5 years ago. That technology with innovation and new IT and so on has moved on. So it's not going to be the same now as it was 5 years ago. And I think there's a way of somehow, how do we take that into account to make sure that when recommendations are made, that they are contemporaneous, that they're concurrent, that they take cognizance of the world as we know it right now, but also that the end in mind has been thought of when it was set out, so that we know that the recommendations are going to come. That's why we set up the inquiry, to learn lessons and make recommendations, and that resourcing and a mechanism to do that is taken
So it can
account
effectively
of.
about decision-making processes as much as anything else. Rebecca?
Yeah, I would just add, so where we're kind of getting to with our kind of ideas, recommendations, is actually around that there are different options for how you might want to do this. And the Telford inquiry is another one where they went back 18 months, 2 years later, and did a review there as well. Then you've also got Sir Brian Langstaff with the infected blood inquiry in the UK, who has kept the inquiry open. And I think that what we've seen is that chairs, inquiry teams have created these opportunities, either going back, or you might have a highly motivated chair who's able to do different things, and that's very important. And so what we're thinking about is that actually, rather than saying you need to have a 2-year like go back 2 years later and have a look, that actually it should be a requirement for some kind of monitoring implementation to be in the final report or be agreed before the inquiry ends. That could be going back in 18 months, 2 years. It could be the chair staying on for another few months to hold another hearing. It could be passing that over to an implementation monitor, which is what they've been using in Australia in some of their inquiries. There are different options that I think would be more suitable to different types of inquiries that deal with different types of public bodies or different parts of government.
With perhaps an obligation on Parliament to look at that one, to ensure the profile isn't lost.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a role for Parliament. We would be wary of suggesting that Parliament takes on a role for monitoring for every inquiry, given that there are 20 ongoing and they're very complex, very different kinds of topics. But there's definitely a role for Parliament to be part of that kind of monitoring, implementation, scrutiny process. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to open out the session. Liz, to be followed by John.
Thank you, and good morning. Can I just put on the record that I'm obviously heavily involved with the El Jamil inquiry in Scotland just now, and I think that's important to say that before I ask these questions. Ms McKee, you were very interesting in an answer to the convener that you feel that when it comes to some public inquiries, the terms of reference are not always absolutely accurate because they have to be dealt with very quickly. Could you give us some examples of where you feel that the terms of reference have maybe not been as accurate as they might have been? Yes,
I think in the same response I would need to go and just triple check my references before I put on the record a name of an inquiry, but I can absolutely do that.
Yeah. I mean, that would be helpful because in the respect of the El Jamel situation, one of the issues, which is a very genuine issue, is that there is a constitutional difference, legislative difference, because the 2015 Act in Scotland has different legislative functions than what would happen on a UK aspect, and therefore the terms of reference for what is a Scottish public inquiry would not necessarily tie up with what the UK terms of reference would be. But if evidence emerges that UK bodies were actually involved in some aspects of the Scottish situation and therefore by definition should be investigated, then that's a very important matter about how to ensure that the UK and the Scottish inquiries are aligned, and I think that happened. I think that's happened in the COVID situation. It's certainly happened in the infected blood scandal, and I just wonder if you have a view about that as to how a jurisdiction in Scotland would be able to have a really good, strong working relationship about the terms of reference with a UK body.
Yeah, that isn't an area that we have been looking at, I'm afraid, but very interesting question.
Do you think it's important that they do, though? Because obviously there are bodies across the UK which will have an impact on what might happen in any part of the UK, and therefore it's important, if there is different legislation governing the public inquiries in these different jurisdictions as opposed to the UK, that it's important surely that there is a coordination with that.
Yeah, I think coordination, transparency and decision making is important across all of this, and if there is an aspect where those things need alignment, then kind of open communication and coordination seems like that would be very important.
And would that circumstance be one where you could foresee a possible change to the terms of reference, an expansion, if information came to light from a different part of the jurisdiction that was being investigated?
Yes, again, going slightly beyond my expertise in this area, looking at that exact mechanism, but to me that would sound right. And I think this comes back to if when you're setting up an inquiry and the minister, if there's kind of like a better process for that early decision making, a minister is able to more transparently get across the kind of justification and the narrative for the inquiry and exactly what it's meant to do, then it's easier, I think, to make a case for changing terms of reference later on as and when new information comes to light, because that process is clearer.
So that better process that you've just spoken about, is that just about transparency, or does something else have to happen?
No, that's actually around having a more bolstered support where we've been looking at that's currently held in the Cabinet Office. And I think from reading the SPICE briefing that the kind of equivalent doesn't exist in the Scottish Government, but that was set up a few years ago and is there's a dedicated team there, but is kind of underfunded and under-resourced for the really rather big job that they have to try and support ministers in that early decision-making, and sometimes can be bypassed in that kind of decision-making process. But where we've looked at, for example, in New Zealand, where they overhauled that, the Department for Internal Affairs have played a very strategic, a very important role in supporting that decision-making through having the knowledge of past inquiries, being able to pull all that information together and then point kind of ministers and show them the kind of range of options, and they also help with the drafting instructions for terms of reference, for example.
We had one witness last week who suggested exactly that, because she felt that there would be a benefit from somebody starting out on a public inquiry to gain very considerable experience from other public inquiries, and that's something, as I understand it, could be done by the Cabinet Office. Is that correct? Yeah,
so it's currently done by the Cabinet Office. I think there's an argument about whether that actually goes to the Ministry of Justice and then links in with some of the other things that are going on there, depending on the role.
Do you think that is an area where there might be some scope for cost reduction?
Yes, if you think about that, having that better decision making up front will then have a knock-on effect on the whole rest of the inquiry. The other thing that the Department for Internal Affairs does in New Zealand is they also act as a kind of corporate host, which I think is a really interesting model. So they support with things like getting rooms together. They actually use government buildings for some things, which is, you need to think through. But setting up the websites, also around getting kind of the secretariat teams together and supporting them. So some of that like early setup stuff, which I think Lord Hardy in the session last week talked about how long that process can take, and we hear that time and time again, that is just a thing that often judges or whoever is leading or inquiry teams, even if they've worked on inquiries before, that's not the main thing of what they're trained to do, and that's very difficult. Things around data sharing as well. There's lots of quite technical things that are involved in setting up an inquiry from the beginning, and having that in-house expertise which doesn't cross over the kind of line of independence of like what the inquiry is actually doing, but it's just there to support the setup process, which I feel like then would give that space for some of the other stuff around knowledge sharing, lesson learning, looking at more innovative methods for the inquiry to use in its processes, by kind of removing some of that time sink at the beginning.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Ms Morgan, could I ask you about what you think the reason is for the growth in the number of public inquiries?
I have absolutely no idea. I mean, clearly things go wrong. Ministers want them examined. The public want them examined. Some of them are duplicative or feel duplicative to us. So we had the Penrose inquiry and then the UK infected blood inquiry. We have the UK COVID inquiry, the Scottish COVID inquiry. And some of that's a timing issue. That's not anybody, by design that has happened. So I can't answer that question because
would you agree with one of our previous witnesses who made the suggestion that perhaps one of the reasons for the growth in public inquiries is because there's a perception that government agencies have been failing to address specific questions, and therefore there has been a frustration amongst victims or people who are demanding a public inquiry that their questions are not being answered in channels that should have been answered. And I think we could all name public inquiries where there are examples of that. Do you think that's a serious problem?
I haven't looked at it, but my experience, my personal experience, and I think that of the organisation, is that any public inquiry is much bigger and much greater than individuals or individual groups not getting answers through other means, through fatal accident inquiries, through whistleblowing. I think it seems much bigger than that. And much broader findings that are found in that space. I mean, the whole country was affected by COVID. The whole country. There's
absolutely.
nobody who escaped being affected by that, and some affected more than others. So there are lessons that need to be learned around those spaces. Whether or not the public inquiry route or one of these other mechanisms would be appropriate for that.
I mean, the reason I'm asking this question, because I think it's a very important question, is to establish just exactly why there has been a growth in the number of public inquiries, because obviously that has an implication for costs. But if it is the case, I'm not saying it is, but if it is the case that one of the reasons is that the complaints have not been dealt with in the forum where they should have been dealt with, then again, that is something that I think we need to take very seriously, because if they should have been dealt with by a health board or whoever it might have been, we might not have got to a public inquiry.
So it may not be the case. It may, of course, be the case that the complaint has been dealt with appropriately, that actions have been taken, but those affected have been dissatisfied with those outcomes and continue to seek more in that regard.
Okay, right, thank you.
Good point. John, to be followed by Michelle.
Thanks very much, Convener. I mean, some of the suggestions you've made and other witnesses have made, like sharing lawyers and getting the rooms fixed up more rapidly and these things, I mean, that might save a little bit here and there. But I suppose I'm not seeing that that's going to make a radical change to the cost and the time. And I've suggested to other witnesses, could we look at it the other way around and say, right, you've got 3 years to do an inquiry and you've got £5 million and you've just got to do the very best you can within that time and that framework. I mean, would that be a major disadvantage as compared to this open-ended approach that we seem to have? Ms McKee, perhaps.
Yeah, so this question of budgets and timelines is interesting. So again, so they do that in New Zealand. They set up they have a budget, they have a timeline, and that is decided early on, kind of in conjunction with the different bodies that are involved in the setup. When I've been testing that recommendation in the UK context, there's been a lot more pushback, some of which I think is valid, which is around that some of the delays are around government or other bodies involved in the inquiry not being ready and not having their kind of like papers and documentation in order, and sometimes those have caused really big delays, which then creates a very uncomfortable situation around extending timelines, negotiating with the government on that when it's been potentially the government that has caused some of those timelines. That was one of the examples that was given to me that can add several months onto it. I think where we think we might be able to get round this, if we're not looking at potentially having timelines and budgets set at the top, and again, because failing to meet those, if we're not sure that the rest of the system is going to be able to meet those, is a massive issue for public trust, which is already a massive issue for public inquiries in this country. Where we've been looking at is potentially doing a kind of new framework which would require changes to the original Inquiries Act, where you, and again, similar to kind of the New Zealand model, which I feel like they've made a compelling case for their reforms, you have a set of all statutory inquiries. So you get past this distinction between statutory and non-statutory, what's the gold standard, what isn't. Everyone has the powers, but they don't need to use them. But they have a model where they have royal commissions, they have public inquiries, and they have government inquiries, and they are, although they have the same powers, are explicitly designed as slightly different models to get at different levels of severity of a topic. Yes. And so the cost and the timelines are quite significantly different for them. So, for example, government inquiries, they've held 10 of them. They take on average 10 months, cost on average 3.5 million. And there were things like SES operations in Afghanistan, drinking water contamination. They've held one public inquiry, which is the kind of next step up around Earthquake Commission performance, which has taken on average 18 months and 3.9 million. And then royal commissions, which are reserved for the highest severity, things like their COVID-19 inquiry. There was a historical abuse in care one, which is quite an outlier because that took a long time. But on average, 20 months and 16 million, which are costs which are quite a lot less than some of the inquiries we have here. There are other reasons for that. But I think we feel that it's about having a suite of options, and timelines, setting timelines and budgets is one thing, but I think there could be problems there. But actually, ministers, when they're setting up an inquiry, having a suite of options which are designed to do slightly different things, that narrative and that justification has been kind of set, and they are supported to make that decision that doesn't look like they are going for a non-statutory inquiry, that doesn't look like it has the powers of the teeth, is actually kind of a more compelling case, I think.
Some of that would require new legislation, is that
would
right?
require...
Because the 2005 Act is what lies behind most of this.
Yeah.
Does the Scottish Parliament have power to change the 2005 Act? Do you know?
So I believe it was adopted under 2007 Act here, if I'm correct. So I'm not exactly sure about the interrelations between those two and whether you would have the power to change that, yeah.
Elsewhere. Okay.
Without going as far as that, as changing the Act, there are other ways in which you can set out the suite of options.
Yes.
And so, for example, the Cabinet Office manual in New Zealand is very detailed in setting out exactly what all the options do. Mm-hmm. The Cabinet Office manual for the UK government is very not detailed in setting out those kind of options. So there's an option to, without changing the Act, actually just be more explicit about what the different types of models can do and when they have been used or potentially would be used in the future.
Yes, because it does seem sometimes that just public pressure builds up and the minister eventually gives way and just accepts that it's going to... I mean, you've been asked quite a lot about terms of reference already, so I'll not go back over that. But, I mean, I was interested, for example, this week that I think the families of the Chinook helicopter disaster were looking for a public inquiry in order to get hold of files. But actually what they want is to get hold of these files. I don't know that they need a public inquiry, but I mean, is that a bit of an outlier? Or I suppose my question is it the case that people are calling for public inquiries when actually they want something else?
I think it's part of this wider question around how do you address state failure. The duty of candour legislation, which is something else that my colleagues are looking at, also sits within this. And I think if you can get that kind of stuff to work kind of early on, that really helps to, because I think that potentially is an outlier. That's about getting access to archived records, which the government has said that they can't release. And so I guess the idea is that a statutory inquiry with its the powers that it holds is the mechanism that they see is available for that.
Although
but,
presumably a military secret still wouldn't be revealed under a public inquiry, would it?
Yeah, and I think there are, I think, for example, the policing inquiry and some other inquiries have run into that exact problem about what is and what can and can't be disclosed.
Right. I mean, Ms Morgan, based on what you've said already, do you think the public has become less tolerant over the decades? That, you know, in the past we just accepted, well, a mistake's been made, but nowadays there's just more of a desire to blame somebody, get revenge, dig into things more?
I think people are generally much better informed about what they should expect and what they can expect. I think they are quite rightly more demanding of the public service and the services that they receive from people. So I think whether they're more demanding, maybe more aware of what is the right thing to do and what their rights are, and they are much better organised.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's what I think, yeah.
That's fair. One of the things in the Act, I think it's section 17, says that the judge or whoever's leading has to avoid unnecessary cost. I mean, I'll start with you, Ms Morgan, this time. I mean, you've been involved in a few inquiries. Is that something you've got, you have a view on? Do you think they are avoiding unnecessary costs, or do you think there are unnecessary costs around?
So I have nothing to measure them against other than the costs that are in here, which seem an awful lot of money. I think it's very difficult because I think there's two sets of costs. There are three sets even of costs. There are the costs of the inquiry that are visible, that are reported against, that can be accounted for here. There are the costs incurred by organisations and core participants that are not included in those inquiry costs. So there's the set that is declared in organisation accounts, my own accounts, for example. And then there is the cost that we have not, that is kind of clearly difficult to identify, those that are held within individual departmental budgets as they've released staff and so on. So, and I think, as we said, the inquiries lack consistency about what they will and will not reimburse in that space. They may well be asked to keep costs as low as possible, but they don't have a budget line with which to measure that against. So, of course, their job is to complete highly competently a public inquiry, and they will do what it costs to make that happen.
Whereas in the NHS, for example, a surgeon just has to work with the equipment they've got available and the staff they've got available, haven't they? They can't just...
And would bid for more, but we have a budget for X, Y and Z and so on, and we make choices about spending a bit more here or a bit more there in order to do that.
Can I just ask you about the figures then that you quoted in your own submission? I think you said it's cost 3.1 million for the NSS for the various inquiries since 21-22, and then later on you mentioned 9 million in legal services. So is the 9 million what you were refunded and the 3 million what you weren't, or can you just explain that?
No. So the 3.1 million, I think, is for the two inquiries that we quoted there, which is direct costs for NSS out of NSS budget. That includes my core team, which now actually, because COVID Inquiring are supporting the board in relation to LGML, which is good knowledge management and good sharing of resource. And it's our legal cost and our counsel cost for those two inquiries. The £9 million cost is the cost that the Central Legal Office have, the cost of their services to other NHS boards, so and other core participants in inquiries. So that's the cost for supporting territorial health boards with the infected blood inquiry, or to support with legal costs for Lothian and Glasgow and the Scottish Hospitals inquiry, for example. So 3.1 NSS cost alone. I assume that each of these territorial boards or other boards that are core participants will have their own teams, their own ways of having dealt with the inquiries. But look, that £9 million is cost attributed to CLO and council.
And how much of that's coming back from the inquiries?
None.
None of it. Right.
None
so
of
that
it.
12, the two together is entirely coming out of the NHS budget.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Ms McKee, this thing about Section 17 avoiding unnecessary costs, does anyone check on that?
I think, not that I'm aware, but I know, having spoken to various chairs and secretaries, that they are very mindful of it. I think what's interesting is that there's to be mindful of the costs, but there is not a requirement, and I'm not sure there necessarily should be, but to think about newer, innovative ways of cost cutting. And I think that again comes down to the fact that there isn't this kind of there isn't this broader kind of research hub that are trying to draw lessons across different inquiries. Some people we spoke to from a law firm, for example, talked about how in most of their other activities they're using regularly AI tools to help with disclosure and things like that alongside paralegals. But when they're doing that exact same work in an inquiry, they're not using those kind of tools. And again, that's often because there's a pressure to get going quickly, not think through exactly how you're going to design a process, and embedded ways of working and processes that people bring from one inquiry to another, working across multiple different inquiries, without having this centralised resource that can sit there and think about actually how can we do this quicker, that worked well there, that didn't work well there, which doesn't exist in an ad hoc inquiry, for example. So yeah, I think there's that Section 17, but there also needs to be this kind of looking forward to kind of other methods and ways of bringing down cost timelines and work.
And do we think that's happening within the UK government?
Not to the extent that it needs to be. I think the team in the Cabinet Office are, they're brilliant, but they're under-resourced, underfunded to kind of be doing that work rather than just dealing with all the inquiries that are currently going on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it strikes me with the COVID inquiry that, we all lived through it. We all know roughly what happened. They're spending a lot of time just going over things, both in Scotland and the UK, which we all knew about already. And I just wonder how much they're gaining. Is there a saving to be made in there that if a lot of information's in the public domain, we don't have to go through it all again?
I think this is around the kind of like purpose and aim of an inquiry, and Dr. Emma Ireton, I think last week, talked very eloquently about exactly what the kind of different purposes are, and often inquiries now are trying to do all of it. So the lesson learning, the correcting the record, finding blame, then there's the justice catharsis part of it, and I think the COVID inquiry is an example of one that is trying to do all of those things, and so inevitably is going to be protracted and long and expensive. The COVID inquiry in the UK also has the particular public engagement process that they ran as well as part of the inquiry. So yes, I think it really comes down to this, like being clear about the purpose and the aims. Otherwise, inevitably,
back to terms of reference at the beginning.
Yes, yeah, that decision-making process, being supported to make those politically very difficult decisions early on, and to kind of justify exactly what the purpose is, being honest and transparent with the public about what this is and isn't going to be looking at and achieving. Yeah.
Okay. And Ms Morgan, I mean, you've been involved in the COVID inquiry, both, I take it. Do you feel there's a lot of new stuff coming to light, or are they just going over things that we all knew about already?
I think there's a level of, I was going to use the word interrogation, but that would be the wrong word. I think questioning, asking that is deeper, and a level of joining up that seems to be being explored at the moment that is bound to be valuable. And I think the Module 1 findings around preparedness, recommendations for preparedness are already being taken up and thought applied to what we could do better in the future. So I guess it's not really for me to say whether it's the right or the wrong or the depth that is there. That's in the inquiry. They seem to be doing a very, very thorough job of it, is what I would say. And the team are very keen to get the answers to their terms of reference.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. Michelle, to be followed by Michael.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I mean, we've talked a lot about costs and governance, and I suppose my first question to yourself, Mary, who's been involved in a multitude of things across the NHS and your particular role, is there any other piece of work that you get involved in that doesn't have any governance or properly monitor costs as you've set out?
I think our costs are very closely monitored as we bring forward the year end, you know, closing last year and so on. So yeah, cost is a big thing. I work in health, though there may be other areas that are not at that level, but I suspect not.
And Rebecca, picking up on the point that my colleague John was kind of focusing on, that we've all said being mindful of the cost. Where, if anywhere, is the real pressure coming from to move it beyond being mindful of the cost? Is there any pressure? I mean, you're obviously looking at it, there's been the Lords Committee, but internally, I mean, within government?
Yeah, I think there is definitely pressure, especially on timelines, actually. I think the problem is that when the inquiry is kind of ongoing, there's that kind of the independence of the inquiry is quite a difficult thing to sometimes manage. I'm not aware that there's any like budgeting, kind of oversight mechanism that currently exists for all of the different inquiries. And again, that is, support with budgeting could be something that like a centralised corporate host kind of model could support with. But again, with a view to kind of keeping that independence of the actual inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, there's no other public sector project that would incur expenditure of potentially 30 million with no governance whatsoever, no stage gating around costs, or just not any, is there?
Yeah.
And in terms of, I suppose, I'm interested in the culture. I mean, it was interesting what you said at the start of the session, Mary, that until you were doing prep for here, you hadn't realised there could be other different types of inquiries. You just thought they're all judge-led statutory. But I suppose from your perspective, Rebecca, how did we get here from the point of view where everybody is like a winner in this? Lawyers get to demand an inquiry, the people or politicians get to demand an inquiry, the lawyers are happy, they're making a lot of money, the government's happy because that's made the issue go away. It's a long time till we know whether the people who were greatly affected by the issue at hand are happy. Could be years and years down the line. But so culturally, how on earth did we get to the point where we are today based on the work and the research you've been doing?
Yeah, so I think one of the important kind of cultural aspects is how public inquiries have become incredibly legalistic in their culture. They have become a lot more like courtrooms, and that has bled into non-statutory inquiries as well. Like, they're often seen as a shorter, sharper method. That's because we're often looking at the kind of the high-level forensic inquiries, like the COVID inquiry, as a comparator. But actually, the same legal firms work on both types and have started to kind of dictate that kind of culture. And I went to go see the COVID inquiry actually as an observer the other day, and I was surprised, having not viewed one like in person, just how legalistic that process is, how forensic the kind of questioning of witnesses who've given evidence in different types of ways is, which adds to it. And I think that is a kind of thing that's been happening over time as legal firms have been involved. We've had multiple inquiries, quite close together, several a year. There's kind of a developed learning for how an inquiry should be run, and those legal firms are able to, now they have developed amazing expertise in this area, have big teams, can come in and kind of help get that going from the beginning, but that really sets the tone. And so there's nothing around kind of that. I mean, there's some areas, but an inquiry doesn't need to be run that way, and that means it becomes very adversarial rather than inquisitorial. There's flexibility within the Act to run an inquiry in a different way. I think the thing is, it becomes about learned behaviour. It becomes around this thing of setting up quickly, all of these things that I kind of mentioned before, that means that you can develop a much more legalistic culture, which adds to time and cost. I think it was a National Audit Office report a few years ago that said, I think it was about 36% of costs of inquiries to the inquiry's legal staff, for example. So that seems to be a big part of this.
And you can see how that would work for all the law firms involved. That then becomes a prevailing culture of how we do inquiries. And of course, guess what? Because they're done that way, it necessitates law firms. And guess what? The law firms who are most likely to get the work are the ones who can claim previous experience. So it becomes self-perpetuating, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of legal firms now that have built up quite large teams of people who work on inquiries because they're involved in all different aspects of it. They're there for as the main legal counsel for the inquiry, core participants. The way that inquiries tend to be run now is that people are asked to submit their own statements, which you then would want to have like kind of legal backing and checks on. There's lawyers involved in a huge part of the process who can, as you said, they've developed this expertise in how you run it and do that very effectively if that's the model in which you want to run an inquiry, but it's not always the most appropriate, effective model for every type of inquiry.
Yeah. And we're aware of where other bodies have looked at this. I mentioned the Lords earlier, but in terms of, obviously, you're mostly kind of facing into Cabinet Office, that you've said, but is there, from your perspective, the UK Government, an appetite to look properly at this? Because clearly things are now completely out of hand. Is there an appetite to look to change it? Because that actually would potentially involve annoying some law firms who are already on this kind of pretty lucrative path.
Yeah, I think there definitely is an appetite. We're definitely at a point now where, like you said, things are sort of out of hand if you look at the numbers and costs and the number of inquiries, the way that public trust is going. And I think the government can see that there's a couple of very big inquiries that have either recently reported or will be reporting. And if those recommendations aren't implemented, that becomes a big problem. So in terms of the appetite there's also, as I mentioned before, the stuff around duty of candour, which I think all ties into this. So I think there is definitely a look being had at kind of this wider state failure question and how we can address that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Camilla. Start by putting on record my own involvement with the LGML inquiry as representing constituents. It's just hopefully quite brief. Mary Morgan is relating to some of the issues that my colleague John was raising regarding that £9 million legal services provided to NHS Scotland boards. Do you bill those boards for the services that you provide?
Yes, it's fee recovery. It's fee recovery, so the Central Legal Office operates like a private firm, but within the NHS, and has that particular expertise to support them. Staff are all employed by us, but we do recover the cost from territorial boards, including my own board. I have to say, they bill me for it as well, even though they're part of me, so yeah.
And what kind of services do they provide?
Well, they provide a full range of legal services. So there's an employment team, there's a litigation team, which would also cover, interestingly enough, the public inquiries. There's a property team, there's a contracts team.
Okay. So we heard last week evidence from a member of the Faculty of Advocates who was saying that he was representing a group of NHS boards within a couple of different public inquiries that were ongoing, including, he mentioned, the COVID inquiry. So, so the £9 million doesn't represent the entirety of the budgets that would be applied for, or the budgetary impact for the NHS boards that are involved in those inquiries. They're just drawing certain services from you, but also engaging other services externally as well. They
will be taking their legal advice, their solicitors, so they'll have solicitors to the inquiry in the way that I have my own solicitor to whatever inquiry that is being dealt with, and the CLO on their behalf will source counsel, senior counsel, junior counsel for inquiry work, so they have their advocates sitting in the inquiry piece to liaise with counsel to inquiry, whatever they are. So that's what the CLO does. Within individual boards or groups of boards, in the infected blood inquiry, for example, NSS was a core participant separately to the territorial health boards who were represented as a group together, as a single core participant. They had different legal teams and different counsel to that which we had. More recently in COVID, we've shared counsel, but in the LGML inquiry, predominantly NHS Tayside impacted by that, they will have their own lawyer that we will provide from the CLO and recharge them. We'll also find them senior and junior counsel in that regard if that's what's required. or indeed maybe one council if that is what's required, and we'll pay the council and recharge them for that. But also in that regard, it just so happens that my team that are referred to here that I have costs for, so my head of inquiry and scrutiny and some of our programme support is going to support NHS Tayside in setting up their administration and so on and so forth in that regard. So there'll be additional costs associated with that.
That's very useful. Do you have any understanding then of the more global figure of the impact of legal costs across all the territorial boards? No, you don't.
Absolutely none. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, since 2007, there's been 10 public inquiries in Scotland, 5 of which are still ongoing, and we got an update on the costs up to 240 million at today's prices. So far now, Scottish Parliament Information Centre, Rebecca, produced a table of costs, and as you pointed out, 36% of that goes on legal fees, but over 10% of it goes on consultancy fees. Who are these consultants and what do they do for public inquiries that's cost the Scottish taxpayer 25 million and the UK taxpayer no doubt considerably more?
That's an area we haven't looked at, I'm afraid.
Right. So I'm just wondering what a consultant would actually do and where they would step in, given you've got lawyers and this, that and the other.
So I haven't looked into it. I would imagine some of that might be like IT consultants, that kind of thing. In
Well, that's more included in other areas of funding. It's
yeah,
just,
interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure, but...
Would you have any idea of that, Mary, given you've been involved in these inquiries?
No, not to that level. I mean, it may be, for example, I don't know, sourcing venues, fixing venues, those kind of things. So, you know, it may be, we would use perhaps property consultants, for example, if we were trying to seek somewhere to have a
25 million is a lot of money, I would have thought, just to check out some venues.
But there may be fit out involved in some of that as well across the inquiries, because they do tend to have specialist fit out and things like that. So I don't know. I could imagine.
I'm in their own business. You know. Okay, I mean, in terms of the inquiries that are ongoing, one of them, the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, is not one we've really touched on much, but it began in December 2014, and up to last week, the costings were at up to March, I should say, of this year, the costs were £95.3 million. Now, it's important people have their say, obviously, but many people who are involved in such an inquiry, one that goes back decades, will have died during the course of that inquiry, and so they'll never see justice to be seen to be done at any level. So surely there's a balance to be struck in terms of these inquiries. You know, none of us are immortal, and if an inquiry is going to last years and years and years, there must be a situation in which a lot of people simply don't actually see what actually the report coming out, never mind the recommendations being effectively implemented. So where should this balance be struck? A lot of it's a follow-up to what John was actually saying. You know, I mean, the Australian COVID inquiry cost £4 million and took 13 months. UK one's already at 200 million, the Scottish one nearly £39 million. How is it likely to deliver more justice than, for example, the Australian one did? So just, where's the balance here?
So I think the balance depends on each individual inquiry, and I think this again is around what is the purpose, and each inquiry will have a different set of purposes and how they interrelate. I think for COVID specifically, as I've said before, it seems like it's tried to do kind of everything, and I think that's because it was very politically different. I would say compared to Australia, we had quite a different experience with COVID, and if we're talking about lesson learning, probably quite a lot more lessons to learn around how that happened and pandemic preparedness for the future. But it is all then being tied in with the specific programme of public engagement and catharsis that they ran as part of the UK COVID inquiry, and also on kind of addressing the historical record and getting things on the record. By the end, there will be an incredible amount of, as Mary was saying before, interrelated record of exactly what happened.
Yes, but if there's a 10,000-page report or whatever is at the end, who's going to read it? Now, Denmark, Sweden, they've all produced COVID reports years ago, you know, ultimately, you know, you get to a stage where you get diseconomies of scale, you know what I mean? And you end up with something so monumental that no one can actually grasp it at the end. Are we not in danger of doing that with COVID and perhaps with the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a danger, and again, it comes down to this, exactly what purpose you're trying to achieve. There's different models for doing different things, there's different ways at getting at lesson learning, and I think these very long, then by default very expensive inquiries aren't getting to that lesson learning immediately. Now, there's different ways of doing it, for example, the interim reports and things like that. If you look to, for example, the Dutch Safety Board, who did their COVID inquiries, they ran 3 separate inquiries that got at very specific things, which were ran in quite a short timeline. That's another model kind of way of addressing your recommendations to specific bodies to kind of just get going as soon as possible.
So given how cumbersome the inquiries are in this country, Scotland and UK actually, relative to other areas, what can we do differently to ensure that the people who clamour for inquiries get the justice they need and deserve, but it doesn't take 5, 10, 15 years and have an impact on, for example, the public services that are having to be foregone in the NHS because we're having to fund some aspects of these inquiries?
So I think it's going to depend on exactly what the topic of the inquiry and how much how many issues there have been, for example, with disclosure of records or the government not being truthful about things in the past, like, for example, the Chinook one that we talked about in Northern Ireland. I think being clear about what the inquiry is for, if we want to get past and we want to learn lessons, there's maybe a new pandemic on the horizon, for example, then there's a different model that you would choose, which would be much faster, much sharper, and much more focused on lesson learning. You can then, for example, run other types of some of the other things that the inquiry is trying to do through other methods, but that will depend, I think, on the topic. But it's about being clear about what the mechanism of an inquiry is actually for the topic up front, and making that political decision making early on, which is what I think other places have been able to do. I think, again, the COVID topic varies country to country by how they were impacted and the kind of number of lessons that need to be learned. But I think that applies to different kind of public inquiry areas. Having that kind of upfront, difficult discussion, decision making early on just helps to set those boundaries much better.
Mary? Where should the balance be structurally, is the point I'm making?
I don't know. I mean, you look at the timelines of these inquiries and you see them taking very, very long periods of time. And I think that's why we came up with the recommendation to have interim findings, because it isn't for us as experiencing inquiry. We're there to respond and to deliver and to answer the questions as they come in, and to provide witness statements in accordance with what's required of us. So I don't think we have a view on that piece, but I think it would be good to get interim findings. I think we've also spoken a lot about those affected by inquiries, by aspects that have that public inquiry. We've spoken about the finding of blame and failure. I don't think as much of an appreciative inquiry happens around public inquiries. It does all have they do have those real negative connotations to them. And there are a couple of things that could be, if you like, better aspects that come out of inquiries, I think, in the periods of time, such as aspects of good practice or good experiences that have been identified. And the other thing that it does give the opportunity to is it gives people like me, our organisations, our health service and our public services the opportunity to tell their story, which in some regards might be important for them for their own learning as well. So we derive a lot of, I'm not saying benefit, but points of learning from preparing and pulling together some of the evidence as well about things that we actually question, think, well, why do we do that? Could we accelerate guidance, preparation a bit faster, for example? So I don't know. I don't have the right balance. I think some of the things that we've highlighted, some of the things that have been highlighted by Rebecca, the choice of inquiry, laying out the terms of reference quickly, are those things that are going to bring balance to it.
I mean, I think it's important people have an opportunity to say their piece, but if it ends up lost in a 10,000-page report, you know, how significant is that going to be in terms of actually having an impact on what happens next? Just one final question to yourself, Rebecca, and that's, you know, 2 weeks ago we took evidence from Professor Cameron asking about the motivation for example, legal teams to actually, you know, deliver more timelessly, shall I put it diplomatically, in terms of these inquiries, because it's seen as perhaps a dripping roast for lawyers, you know. Where's the motivation for them to actually bring these things in more quickly and less expensively?
I imagine I would think the motivation would differ across different legal teams. I'd say the people that I have spoken to who are particularly interested in this topic and therefore have made time for me to speak to them are very motivated to find a way to cut down the time of inquiries and get to lesson learning earlier. Some of these people have worked on inquiries for 15, 20 years and find it very frustrating that lessons aren't learned, things are happening again. I mean, those individuals working in those teams, I can't speak to the sort of higher level of the legal firms and exactly what their motivations are, but there's plenty of people in the legal profession who've worked on these inquiries over and over again, very frustrated themselves by the issues that we've discussed.
Because there's a concern about vested interest here, you know, in the situation that we have at the moment continuing. Mary, you want to come in there?
Well, I did just about that piece of balance. I think we've yet to see what AI, for example, can bring to shorten time of public inquiries. We know from the papers that UK COVID inquiry have started to use AI. I think there's something called Retaliate or something like that. We ourselves, in gathering up some of the questions, tried to use AI to identify questions that were being asked of particular core participants from particular areas. And okay, it wasn't absolutely perfect just now, but it did give us quite a lot of themes and it saved quite a lot of time. So there are maybe innovations, new ideas that are coming to the fore that might help some of those timelines and for inquiries to be more efficient in their processes.
I have to say, when we put that to the Faculty of Advocates, they said, oh aye, but even though you get the same document many times, some folk have annotated on it, so you still have to look at them. Anyway, I want to thank you both for your evidence today. It's really appreciated. Just to give you a final point, if there's anything you feel we haven't touched on or something you still want to say, now's your opportunity to come forward and say anything that you feel we've omitted and you're desperately to put on record. Anything at all?
Not for me, thank you.
Nothing
no,
from me.
No, okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much for your evidence. We will continue with our inquiry. That concludes our evidence session and indeed the committee meeting today. So I'll call this meeting to an end. Thank you very much.